When he walked down that quiet hallway, he had no idea he was about to step into one of the most uncomfortable and revealing moments of his leadership. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a rare break from the constant responsibilities, meetings, sermons, and crises that seemed to follow him everywhere. The atmosphere earlier that day had been warm, prayerful, even hopeful, but as evening settled in and small groups drifted into private conversations, Bishop Porter noticed that a few elders had been missing for far too long. At first, he thought nothing of it. Leaders often needed space to think or pray alone, but something stirred inside him, a subtle nudge, a quiet instinct urging him to check on them. As he walked deeper into the retreat house, the halls grew strangely silent. A soft murmur drifted from behind a closed door, faint enough to be dismissed, yet it pulled him closer like a thread. He reached for the doorknob and paused, sensing tension he couldn't yet explain. The moment the door cracked open, the atmosphere changed. A sudden, stunned stillness filled the room. Several elders, visibly startled, snapped their heads toward him as if caught in a moment they wished they could rewind. Their expressions were a mixture of guilt, panic, and exhaustion. Not the faces of men doing wrong, but the faces of men who had been trying desperately to hide something deeper. And then he noticed it, a single bottle sitting in the center of the table, surrounded by half-filled glasses. It wasn't the bottle itself that shocked him, it was the heaviness in the air around it, the feeling that this wasn't a scene of rebellion, but a scene of escape. The elders jumped up almost in unison, speaking over one another. "Bishop, we can explain. It's not what it looks like. We just needed a moment." Their voices trembled, their bodies stiff, their eyes pleading for understanding. The bottle became symbolic, a representation of something they had been holding inside far longer than they intended, a symbol of leaders cracking under pressure, men who had run out of ways to cope with burdens no one else fully understood. He didn't step back, he didn't storm out, he simply stood in the doorway, absorbing the weight of the moment. What he saw was not a scene of scandal, it was a scene of exhaustion, a moment where spiritual leaders, overwhelmed by expectations, responsibilities, and silent battles, found themselves seeking comfort in a way they had never intended to be seen. And as the room fell into a fragile hush, he realized he hadn't just walked into a private room, he had walked into the unspoken pain of men too afraid to admit they were breaking. The moment the door opened, the room froze. And in that silence, something far more revealing than the bottle on the table came to light. What erupted next wasn't chaos, but a wave of confusion so thick it felt like the air itself had tightened. The elders scrambled to their feet, their faces pale, their voices trembling, as they rushed to explain themselves. But their explanations weren't smooth or confident. They stumbled over their own words, contradicting themselves, speaking too quickly, then too softly, each man trying desperately to bridge a gap he didn't fully understand. It became clear immediately, this wasn't a group of men indulging in rebellion. This was a group of men caught in a moment they were ashamed of, not because they were doing something malicious, but because they were hiding a truth they didn't know how to voice. The confusion in the room didn't come from guilt, it came from vulnerability abruptly exposed. One elder tried to speak, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. Another leaned heavily on the table for support, as if the emotional weight of the moment had become too much to stand under. A third rubbed his forehead, breathing shakily, his eyes avoiding Bishop Porter's gaze. The tension swirled between them like a storm waiting to break. And for the first time in a long time, these seasoned leaders, men known for strength, confidence, and resolve, looked small, not weak, but worn from years of holding things in, worn from expectations that never loosened, worn from the belief that pastors and elders must always be composed, always be spiritual giants, always be the example. As their explanations overlapped, "We were just talking, we didn't mean for it to look this way, we needed a break, Bishop." The truth behind their frantic words slowly surfaced. They weren't afraid of judgment for the bottle, they were afraid of being seen as human. They were afraid that showing even a glimpse of personal struggle would tear down the image people held of them. They were afraid that a moment of emotional escape would be interpreted as moral collapse. And beneath that fear was something far deeper: exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but spiritual and emotional exhaustion built up over months, maybe years. Exhaustion that had pushed them into this room, around this table, seeking relief in the only way they felt safe doing, without breaking down publicly. Bishop Porter didn't need to raise his voice, he didn't need to reprimand them. The confusion filling the room revealed everything. These weren't men rebelling against their calling. They were men overwhelmed by the weight of it, men who had spent years holding others together while silently falling apart behind the scenes. In that tangled moment of shock and scattered explanations, it became painfully clear. This wasn't a scandal waiting to explode. It was a cry for understanding that had been waiting far too long to be heard. What unfolded in the minutes after that initial shock was not a confrontation, but an unraveling. As the elders attempted to explain themselves, their voices trembling and their hands shaking, Bishop Porter began to notice something that had nothing to do with the bottle on the table. It was the heaviness in their eyes, a heaviness that could not be produced by guilt alone. These were men who looked tired in a way sleep could not fix, men who looked burdened in a way prayer alone had not eased, men who had been carrying responsibilities, expectations, and emotional weight so quietly and for so long that it had begun to crush them from the inside out. And, as he watched them stumble through fragmented sentences, the truth emerged like a whisper from beneath the chaos. These elders were suffering, silently, invisibly, deeply. Their shoulders slumped, not from embarrassment, but from fatigue. Their hands trembled, not because they feared being punished, but because they feared being exposed. For months, maybe even years, they had been pushing themselves past the limits of their emotional endurance. They attended every meeting, counseled every family, solved every crisis, and supported every member, while ignoring their own breaking points. Ministry had become a place where they poured endlessly but rarely received, where they were expected to be strong, wise, spiritual, grounded, even when their own lives were cracking beneath the surface. And the bottle on the table, whatever it actually contained, was not the root of the problem. It was a symptom, a sign, a hint that the real issue ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. One elder finally sank into his chair, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath for a year. He confessed that he hadn't taken a real day off in months, that the demands of the congregation were wearing him thin. Another admitted he was emotionally exhausted from counseling families through grief and trauma while having no one to talk to about his own struggles. A third spoke quietly about the pressure of appearing spiritually flawless, the fear that admitting his stress would make him look weak or unfit for leadership. And as each man shared, the atmosphere in the room shifted from panic to heartbreaking honesty. They weren't defending themselves anymore. They were confessing their humanity. Bishop Porter listened, his heart growing heavier with each word. This wasn't misconduct. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't disrespect. It was burnout. Spiritual burnout. Emotional burnout. The kind of burnout that pushes even the strongest leaders into moments where they seek escape in ways they would never choose if they weren't already drowning. And in that instant, he understood something vital. These men weren't struggling with temptation. They were struggling with exhaustion so deep that it had blurred their judgment. What he stumbled upon that night wasn't a scandal. It was a cry for help, a moment where men who had been expected to be pillars finally cracked beneath the weight of silent suffering. And it was in that raw, trembling silence that the real story began. Not about what they were, but about what they had been carrying for far too long. What happened next was the moment no one in that room would ever forget. The moment that turned an uncomfortable discovery into a revelation that cut straight to the heart of leadership, pressure, and human fragility. After the elders' frantic explanations faded into uneasy silence, Bishop Porter stepped deeper into the room. The faint clinking of glasses, the stillness of their bodies, the tension in the air, everything pointed to the truth they could no longer hide. These men were hurting, but before he could speak, something happened that shifted the atmosphere entirely. One of the elders, a man known for his strength, his authority, his unshakable presence, suddenly broke down. His voice, usually commanding, trembled as he whispered, "Bishop, we didn't know where else to go." The room fell completely still. His shoulders shook, his hand covered his face, and in that vulnerable moment, everything they had been trying to hide came pouring out without a single explanation needed. Then came the moment that stunned Bishop Porter even more deeply. The realization that what he was witnessing wasn't rebellion, wasn't disrespect, and wasn't hypocrisy. It was a group of leaders at the end of their emotional rope. They had walked onto stages with confidence while carrying silent battles off stage. They had prayed for others while privately feeling spiritually depleted. They had counseled countless families through crises while quietly drowning in their own. And now, faced with the weight of their own humanity, they couldn't pretend anymore. The bottle on the table, once the center of confusion, faded into the background. The real story was written on their faces. It was exhaustion. It was pressure. It was the crushing expectation to always be strong while never having space to be weak. As Bishop Porter faced them, a sudden clarity hit him with full force. He had missed the subtle signs, the strained smiles, the long pauses, the heaviness hidden behind the laughter. Moments he had brushed off as normal ministry fatigue were actually cries for help that went unspoken because church culture had taught these men that vulnerability was dangerous, that the moment a leader admitted pain, people would question their calling. He realized they had been living under the impossible burden of appearing perfect while feeling broken. and the room reflected that truth in real time. Trembling hands, teary eyes, voices cracking under the pressure of unspoken need. One elder admitted that ministry expectations had swallowed his life until he felt like a shell of himself. Another said he had been trying to be the strong one for so long that he no longer knew how to ask for support. A third confessed that he had been praying for others while silently begging God for strength just to make it through another week. Their words weren't excuses, they were confessions. Honest, raw, heartbreaking confessions. And that night, Bishop Porter didn't see men failing their roles. He saw men who had given everything until there was nothing left for themselves. In that emotional, fragile moment, the shocking part wasn't the bottle. The shocking part was the truth it revealed. Leaders can suffer quietly for years before anyone notices, and sometimes it takes an unexpected moment, a misunderstood scene, a broken pause, a trembling confession, for the pain they've been hiding to finally surface. That night, in a dimly lit retreat room, humanity broke through leadership titles, and the real struggle was laid bare. And what began as a confusing discovery became a turning point of truth that none of them would ever forget. What unfolded behind that closed door was not an argument, not a disciplinary moment, and not the stern confrontation anyone expected. Instead, something deeply human happened, something that revealed wounds none of them had dared to admit out loud. After the elders finally stopped trying to defend themselves, after the weight of their confessions settled thickly in the air, Bishop Porter asked them a simple question: "Why didn't you come to me?" The room went silent, eyes drifted downward, hands fidgeted nervously, and then, almost reluctantly, one elder spoke. His voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with emotion he had held back for far too long. "Bishop, we didn't want to burden you. We didn't want you to think we were weak." That single sentence cracked open everything they had been hiding. One by one, the elders began revealing truths they had kept locked in their hearts, truths that painted a picture far more heartbreaking than any scandal could. They admitted the pressure had become unbearable. They talked about sleepless nights spent worrying about the congregation, financial strain at home, unresolved grief, and the constant fear of disappointing the people who looked up to them. One man confessed that he had been counseling families through heartbreak while dealing with his own private depression. Another said he felt guilty every time he needed rest because he believed a true leader should push through pain without complaint. A third broke down completely as he admitted he had been praying for strength he no longer felt he possessed, afraid that if he revealed his struggle, he would be asked to step aside. The more they spoke, the clearer the truth became. These elders hadn't gathered in that room to rebel, they had gathered because they were drowning. But the most powerful revelation came when one elder, usually silent and composed, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled note. He hesitated before handing it to Bishop Porter, his hands trembling. "I wrote this to myself last week," he said softly. "I didn't know if I could keep going." The note wasn't long, but it was raw, a confession of burnout, fear, and emotional collapse, a quiet plea for help he hadn't been brave enough to show anyone. As Bishop Porter read it, he felt his heart break open. This wasn't about discipline. This was a cry for rescue. This was leadership stretched beyond its limits. This was a reminder that every strong man has a moment where he fears he might break. In that fragile moment, Bishop Porter realized something deeper than disappointment. These weren't leaders failing the church. These were men the church had failed to protect. They'd carried everyone's burdens but had no place to set down their own. And that night, inside that small retreat room, the truth finally came out. Spiritual leaders are not superheroes. They are human. They bleed. They tire. They need compassion just as much as they give it. And sometimes, it takes a moment of unexpected exposure to reveal the silent suffering that has been eating away at them piece by piece. The letter didn't uncover wrongdoing. It uncovered the emotional cost of leadership. And in that tear-filled, trembling moment, Bishop Porter knew this wasn't the time for correction. It was the time for healing. When the truth finally emerged beyond the walls of that retreat room, it did not explode into scandal or ignite controversy as many would have feared. Instead, it spread quietly, carried gently through whispers of compassion rather than shouts of accusation. The story reached the congregation not as a tale of wrongdoing, but as a revelation of something far more profound: the humanity of their leaders. People didn't react with anger. They reacted with heartbreak. They began to understand that the men they looked to for spiritual strength had been silently battling emotional exhaustion, private pain, and unspoken fears for far longer than anyone realized. And instead of judging them, the church found itself reflecting. How many times had they leaned on these elders without wondering who the elders leaned on? How often had they expected them to be flawless while overlooking the heavy load they carried day and night? The truth became a mirror, not exposing shame, but exposing need. A need for compassion, a need for rest, a need for leaders to be allowed to be human. But what shocked everyone most was not the elders' moment of weakness, it was the transformation that followed. The incident sparked conversations that had been avoided for years. The elders, once afraid to show vulnerability, began speaking more openly about their struggles. Bishop Porter implemented moments of reflection, counseling, and even designated Sabbath days specifically for leadership, something no one had ever considered before. The church realized that spiritual authority does not erase emotional limits, and that holiness does not cancel human frailty. And as these truths settled into the hearts of the congregation, something remarkable happened: unity, not the kind built on perfection, but the kind built on shared understanding. Members began praying, not just for guidance, but for the well-being of their leaders. They began offering support rather than demands. Conversations shifted from expectation to empathy. Where there had once been a silent distance between pulpit and pew, there now grew a bridge of honesty and grace. And for the first time in a long time, the elders felt safe, safe to breathe, safe to confess, safe to heal. As for Bishop Porter, the moment reshaped him as a leader. He no longer viewed the incident as a breach of conduct, but as a breaking open of hearts that had been hardened by pressure and isolation. He saw in his elders not failure, but fatigue, not rebellion, but overwhelm, not disgrace, but a desperate need for rescue. And in embracing that truth, he helped guide the church into a new season, one where leaders were cared for, not just expected from. The incident that could have destroyed reputations instead restored perspective. It reminded everyone that leadership is not a pedestal. It is a weight, a sacred weight, carried by imperfect people who need grace as much as they preach it. And as the story settled into the fabric of the church, the greatest shock of all became clear. The moment that appeared devastating was actually the beginning of their healing. In the end, the moment that seemed like it would break everything became the moment that finally put everything back into place. What began as an unexpected discovery, a room filled with tension, vulnerability, and unspoken pain, revealed a truth the church had forgotten: even those who lead need somewhere to fall. The elders, once seen only as pillars of strength, were finally understood as men carrying silent burdens far heavier than their robes and titles ever showed. And the pastor, who walked into that room thinking he had found a problem, instead found a cry for help that had been echoing beneath the surface for far too long. But instead of shame, there was healing. Instead of judgment, there was compassion. Instead of division, there was unity. The incident peeled back the polished surface of leadership and exposed the beating hearts underneath. Hearts that had grown tired, hearts that needed rest, hearts that needed grace. And when transparency finally replaced silence, a new kind of strength emerged, a strength built not on performance but on honesty, not on fear but on understanding, not on perfection but on shared humanity. The congregation learned that their leaders were not slipping, they were struggling, and the elders learned that asking for help was not weakness, it was wisdom. Through tears, confessions, and difficult conversations, a new foundation was laid. One made of empathy, one made of truth, one made of the simple but powerful realization that even spiritual giants have limits. And as the church moved forward, something beautiful happened. The weight on every shoulder grew lighter, the leaders breathed easier, the members prayed deeper, and Bishop Porter, once shaken by what he saw, emerged with a renewed purpose to shepherd not only the flock, but the shepherds themselves. So the moment that could have shattered everything instead became the spark that healed what had been hurting in silence, a reminder to every church, every leader, every believer: even those who pour into others must be poured into. Even the strongest need rest. And sometimes, the most devastating revelations are not meant to expose failure, but to reveal the path toward restoration.